Okay, so this is going to be your notes on how to multiply monomials, which is also known as the product rule. So it's always going to be a two-step process. The first step that you always do is you multiply the coefficients, and we will talk what a coefficient is in a second. And then the second step that you do is you use the product rule to simplify the variables. Okay? And what the product rule is, if you were reading a math book, you would see that the product rule says this, that if you are multiplying two or more items together that have the same base, like x and x, or w and w, or 3 and 3, it doesn't matter if they are variables or numbers, but as long as they're the same, and each of those bases have an exponent. Like let's say we have x to the second times x to the fourth. The product rule says what you do is that you add the exponents together. So x to the second times x to the fourth, you would add the 2 and the 4 up, and that would be equal to x to the 6th power. Let's say if you had w to the 5th power times w to the 3rd power, the product rule says if you are multiplying, that's what the word product means, two values that have the same base, you add the exponents together. So w, you would add the 5 and the 3 together, and this would be equal to w to the 8th power. Okay, and then it works the same if you have 3 and 3. So let's say this 3 had an exponent of 2, and let's say this 3 had an exponent of 7. What you do is you leave the bases the same. Like when I had x and x, I left x as the base. When I had w times w, I left w as the base. So if I have 3 and 3, you leave the base as 3, and the product rule says when you're multiplying, you add the exponents together. So you would add the 3 or the 7 and the 2 together. So this would be equal to 3 to the 9th power. Okay, so that's the product rule. So what we're going to do is we have 19 problems here. We will go through and simplify most of them. We're not going to simplify all of them. Okay, so in number 1, it says use the product rule to simplify the following monomials. The product rule once again says if you're multiplying two values that have the same base, you add the exponents together. So here we have x to the second times x to the third. So what we would do is we would add the 2 and the 3 up, so this would become x to the 5th power. Okay, in number 2 we have a to the 9th times just a. Now if there is no exponent showing, the exponent is always a 1. So to simplify this, you would add the 9 and the 1 up. So a to the 9th times a to the 1st would simplify into a to the 10th power. Okay, moving on to number 3. Now number 3 is where we're going to have to use the very first step. So notice when you're multiplying monomials or you're using the product rule, the very first thing you do is you multiply the coefficients. The coefficients are always the numbers before the variables. So you would take the 4, which is a coefficient for the first parentheses, you would take the 3, which is a coefficient for the second parentheses, and you would multiply those together. 4 times 3 makes 12. Then the second step you do is you use the product rule to simplify the variables. In this case, the variables are the x's. And the product rule says if you're multiplying and they have the same bases, you add the exponents up. So you would add the 2 and the 5 up. So this problem would become 12x to the 7th power. Okay, moving on to number 4. We have 3x to the 6th power. We're multiplying it by 5x to the 2nd power. Step number 1 is you multiply the coefficients. So you would multiply the 3 times the 5. That would make 15. Step number 2 is we use the product rule to simplify the variables. My variables are x. I'm going to add the 6 and the 2 up. So this problem would simplify to 15x to the 8th power. All right? Moving up, number 5, same way. First thing we do, we have coefficients, which are 5 and a 6. So I actually multiply the coefficients together. 5 times 6 makes 30. And then I use the product rule to simplify the variables. So I take the variable x and I take the 2 and the 4. The product rule says to add the exponents together when you're multiplying. So this problem becomes 30x to the 6th power. Number 6, negative 4. Now notice in this problem I have a negative 4. That's a coefficient. And then I have multiple variables. I have an a to the 3rd and I have a b. And then I'm multiplying it by 3. And then I have an a to the 2nd and I have a b to the 5th. Okay, so I'm going to simplify it the same way as I did number 4 and number 5. First step that I do is I multiply the coefficients together. My coefficients are negative 4 from the first parentheses and 3 from the second parentheses. I actually multiply those. Negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. And then I'm going to simplify the variables. And I'm going to simplify them one at a time in alphabetical order. So I'm going to start with the a. I have a 3rd power and I have a 2nd power. I add those up. So I get a to the 5th power. Okay. Then I simplify the b's. And in this first b, once again, if you're not showing an exponent, that means the exponent is 1. I'm going to use the product rule, which says I add the exponents, 5. So I get b to the 6th power. Negative 12, a to the 5th, b to the 6th would be my answer to that one. Okay, and now I'm just going to go through and do a couple more so that we see how to do all of them. Okay, so if let's go ahead and skip down to number 8. In number 8, we're multiplying 3 things together. So you simplify it the same way. We're going to use the product rule. Step number 1 is you always multiply the coefficients. Well, in number 8, I have 3 coefficients. I have a coefficient of 2. I'm going to multiply that by the coefficient of negative 5. And then I'm going to multiply that by the coefficient of 3. Multiplying all those together, 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. Negative 10 times 3 gives me negative 30. Then step number 2 is I'm going to use the product rule to simplify the variables. In this case, my only variable is y, and the product rule says add the exponents together when you're multiplying if they have the same base. That y has an exponent of 1, plus that y has an exponent of 2, plus that y has an exponent of 3. Adding those together, I get y to the 6. So number 8 would simplify to negative 30 y to the 6th power. Okay? Number 9, I'm multiplying 3 different parts together. These parts are called monomials. Monomial just means that each one is one expression. So I'm taking negative 2xy, I'm going to multiply it by xy, and then I'm going to multiply it by 3x to the 2nd, y to the 3rd. Okay, so step number 1 is I multiply the coefficients. This first parentheses coefficient is negative 2. The second parentheses does not have a coefficient, so I'm not going to multiply by anything, but the third parentheses has a coefficient of positive 3. Multiplying those together, I get negative 6. Then I'm going to use the product rule, step number 2, to simplify the variables. I have x's and y's. I'm going to simplify them in alphabetical order, so the x's first.
All staff, please post your attendance.
Okay, so number 9, I'm going to start with the x. This first x is not showing an exponent, so that's a 1. I move over to the second parentheses. That x also has an exponent of 1. I move over to the third parentheses. That x has an exponent of 2. Adding them all together, 1 plus 1 plus 2 gives me x to the 4th power. The product rule says add the exponents together when you're multiplying of variables that have the same base. Okay, now I have to do the same product rule with the y's. So the first parentheses, y has an exponent of 1. The second parentheses has an exponent of 1 for the y. I'm going to add. The third parentheses has an exponent of 3. So that adding those up, that gives me y to the 5th power. So I get negative 6, x to the 4th, y to the 5th power. Okay? And that's pretty much how you're going to do all of them for the rest of the problems there. Okay, one more to go. Let's go ahead and do number 12. Okay, I'm multiplying a -4, and I'm multiplying it by rs to the second power, and then I'm going to multiply that by -5r to the 4th s. So once again, when I'm simplifying these, the multiplication problems, the first step I do is I multiply the coefficients. -4 is a coefficient. I'm going to multiply that. That second part right there has no coefficient, so I'm not going to worry about it. The third part has a -5 as a coefficient. -4 times -5 gives me +20. Then I'm going to use the product rule to simplify the variables in alphabetical order. So my first variable is r. That r has an exponent of 1. And then I'm going to add it to that r's exponent, which is 4. So I get r to the 5th power. Then I work on simplifying the s's. So I start right here. I have an s, and the first s I see has a second power. I'm going to add it to the next s, which isn't showing an exponent, so that's a 1. So I get 20 r to the 5th, s to the 3rd.